December 1945, a dimly lit interrogation room in Nuremberg, Germany. Across a wooden table sat General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge. American intelligence officers asked him which Allied commander he feared most. Von Manteufel's answer shocked them. Patton, he said, without hesitation. Then he added something that made the stenographer pause mid-sentence. Montgomery? We called him our best weapon. The American officers exchanged glances. Montgomery was Britain's most celebrated general, the hero of El Alamein, the man who had broken Rommel's Africa Corps, the field marshal who commanded all Allied ground forces on D-Day. And here was a German general calling him a weapon for the Wehrmacht. But von Manteuffel wasn't joking. He explained that Montgomery's slow, methodical tactics gave German forces something they desperately needed in 1944 and 1945: time. Time to regroup after devastating defeats, time to establish new defensive positions, time to evacuate trapped armies before Allied pincers closed, time to extend the war by months, perhaps even years. Within weeks, other captured German commanders would echo von Manteufel's assessment. Within months, American military historians would begin asking uncomfortable questions about the general Churchill called Britain's finest. Within years, the evidence would become undeniable. The Wehrmacht's most dangerous opponent wasn't the German army. It was George Patton. Their greatest asset? Bernard Montgomery. To understand how one of the Allies' top generals became the enemy's secret weapon, you need to go back to October 1942, to the desert sands of North Africa, to a place called El Alamein. This was where Montgomery built his reputation. This was where he developed the tactical philosophy that would define his entire war. And this was where German intelligence officers first recognized a pattern they could exploit. Bernard Law Montgomery took command of Britain's 8th Army in August 1942 during one of the darkest moments of the North African campaign. Rommel's Africa Corps had pushed the British back to within 60 miles of Alexandria. The Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to India and the Middle East, was threatened. Churchill desperately needed a victory. He needed a hero. Montgomery promised both, but only on his terms. Montgomery's terms were simple: no offensive until he was absolutely ready, no attack until he had overwhelming superiority in men, tanks, artillery, and supplies, no movement until every detail had been planned, rehearsed, and triple-checked. His staff began calling it the Montgomery method: meticulous preparation, crushing firepower, methodical execution. The German staff had a different name for it: predictable. Montgomery spent 2 full months preparing for the Second Battle of El Alamein. He built up massive supply dumps. He trained his troops relentlessly in coordinated infantry, tank, artillery operations. He organized an elaborate deception plan, including a dummy water pipeline that was deliberately constructed slowly to convince Rommel the attack wouldn't come until November. He positioned over 1,000 tanks and assembled the largest artillery concentration ever seen in North Africa. When the attack finally came on October 23, 1942, it was devastating. British artillery fired over 1 million shells in the first 5 days. Allied air superiority meant Rommel's forces were pounded from above, while Montgomery's infantry ground forward meter by meter. The Africa Corps fought desperately, but couldn't match the material superiority Montgomery had assembled. By November 4th, Rommel was retreating. The British had won their first major land victory against Germany. Churchill ordered church bells rung throughout Britain for the first time since 1940. Montgomery became a national hero overnight. The newspapers called him the general who had finally beaten the Desert Fox. King George VI made him a Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath. Britain had found its Wellington, its Nelson for the modern age. But German intelligence officers analyzing the battle reached a very different conclusion. General Fritz Bayerlein, Rommel's chief of staff, observed that Montgomery's strength was not genius, but thoroughness.
He left nothing to chance, Bayerlein noted in his post-battle report. This was meant as tactical analysis, not a compliment, because German defensive doctrine was built around rapid maneuver, trading space for time and exploiting enemy mistakes. Montgomery's methodical approach gave them none of those opportunities at El Alamein. But Bayerlein understood something crucial. Montgomery's cautious style only worked when he had overwhelming material advantage.
What happened when Montgomery didn't have that advantage revealed the fatal weakness German commanders would later exploit. After El Alamein, Rommel retreated 1,400 miles across Libya toward Tunisia. Montgomery pursued, but cautiously, too cautiously. Despite having broken the Africa Corps, despite Rommel being in full retreat with fuel shortages and supply problems, Montgomery stopped repeatedly to build up supplies and reorganize his forces. He advanced an average of just 15 miles per day. Rommel escaped with the core of his army intact. He crossed into Tunisia and established new defensive positions. The man Montgomery had defeated at El Alamein would fight for 5 more months in North Africa because Montgomery's pursuit lacked the aggressive speed that might have destroyed the Africa Corps completely. American commanders arriving in Tunisia noticed immediately. Patton, who would take command of the Second Corps in March 1943, was blunt in his diary. "Montgomery is a tired little fart," he wrote, "always afraid to take a chance." But the pattern was set. Montgomery would prepare meticulously, attack with overwhelming force, win the initial battle, then advance so cautiously that the defeated enemy escaped to fight another day. Sicily, in July 1943, proved the pattern wasn't a fluke. Montgomery commanded the British 8th Army during the invasion, while Patton commanded the U.S. 7th Army. The plan gave Montgomery the main coastal road to Messina, while Patton's forces would protect Montgomery's flank. Montgomery landed against light resistance on July 10th. The road to Messina was open. Speed was essential because the Germans were beginning to evacuate their forces across the Strait of Messina to mainland Italy. Every day of delay meant more German troops escaping, but Montgomery didn't race for Messina. He stopped to build up supplies. He waited for his artillery to be properly positioned. He prepared methodical set-piece attacks against German defensive positions that more aggressive commanders would have bypassed. Patton, relegated to a supporting role, became furious watching Montgomery waste time. Against orders, Patton launched his own race for Messina along the northern coast of Sicily. His troops advanced so fast they outran their supply lines. They took risks Montgomery never would have tolerated. And on August 17th, American troops entered Messina first. Patton beat Montgomery to the objective Montgomery was supposed to capture. The humiliation stung. But the real disaster was that 100,000 German and Italian troops escaped across the Strait of Messina during the Sicily campaign. They evacuated with their equipment, their weapons, and their organizational structure intact. Those troops would form the backbone of German resistance in Italy for the next 2 years. Montgomery's cautious advance had given them exactly what they needed: time to organize an evacuation that more aggressive Allied tactics might have prevented. German commanders took notes. General Hans-Jürgen Arnhem, who commanded Axis forces in Tunisia, was captured and interrogated after the North African campaign ended. He told his interrogators that Montgomery was a very good general, very thorough but predictable. When asked to elaborate, von Arnhem explained that Montgomery always did the same thing: build up supplies, prepare artillery positions, attack frontally with superior force, then pause to reorganize. "We always knew what he would do next," von Arnhem said. "The only question was how much time we had before he did it." The interrogators filed their reports. American commanders read them with interest. But Montgomery was Britain's hero. Churchill protected him fiercely. And Montgomery had won his battles, even if his victories came at a slower pace than they might have. Besides, the invasion of France was approaching. Montgomery would command all Allied ground forces for Operation Overlord. Surely the biggest operation of the war would be different. It wasn't. Montgomery landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, with clear objectives. The British and Canadian forces under his command were supposed to capture Caen on D-Day itself.
Caen was crucial. It sat at the center of the Allied beachhead. Roads radiated from it in all directions. The terrain south of Caen was perfect tank country, ideal for a breakout toward Paris. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel understood Caen's importance. He concentrated his panzer divisions there to hold the city at all costs. Montgomery attacked Caen on D-Day and was stopped by the 21st Panzer Division. He attacked again on June 7th, stopped again. He tried flanking maneuvers. The Germans held. Montgomery brought up more artillery, more tanks, more infantry. The Germans reinforced. Through June and into July, Montgomery battered against German defenses around Caen, with casualties mounting on both sides. The city that was supposed to fall on June 6th wasn't fully captured until July 20th, 6 weeks late. Montgomery would later claim he never intended to take Caen quickly. He said his real strategy was to draw German armor to the British sector so the Americans could break out in the west. This became the official British narrative. But Montgomery's own battle orders before D-Day clearly stated Caen was to be captured on June 6th. His slow, methodical approach had failed to achieve the objective, so he retroactively claimed the failure was the plan. What German commanders saw was very different from Montgomery's post-war justifications. They saw a general who attacked the same objectives repeatedly, using the same methods. General Heinrich Eberbach, who commanded Panzer Group West in Normandy, was captured in August 1944. His interrogation report contains a striking assessment. Montgomery's operations were like clockwork, Eberbach said. We could set our watches by his artillery barrages. 3 days of preparation, then the attack. If it failed, he would pause, bring up more supplies, and try again in exactly the same way.
But the real catastrophe wasn't Caen. It was what happened in August 1944 at a place called the Falaise Gap. This was the moment when Montgomery's cautious tactics allowed the German army to escape destruction and extend the war by 8 months. By August 12, 1944, the German position in Normandy had collapsed. American forces under Patton had broken out at Avranches and were racing eastward. Bradley's forces were pushing south. Montgomery was finally advancing from the north. The entire German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were being caught in a pocket near the town of Falaise. The gap between Allied pincers was closing. If Montgomery pushed south aggressively while American forces pushed north, they could trap over 100,000 German troops with their tanks, artillery, and equipment. The destruction of 2 entire German armies would leave France wide open. Paris could be liberated within days. The German border might be reached by September. The war could be over by Christmas. Everything depended on closing the Falaise Gap quickly. Montgomery hesitated. On August 13th, the gap was still 20 miles wide. Polish and Canadian forces under Montgomery's command were supposed to advance and seal it shut. But Montgomery ordered them to stop and reorganize. He wanted to prepare properly for the next phase. He wanted his supply situation clarified. He wanted to avoid friendly fire incidents as Allied forces from north and south converged. Patton's forces, racing up from the south, were ordered to stop and wait for Montgomery. The Germans couldn't believe their luck. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, immediately began organizing a fighting withdrawal through the gap. Panzer divisions formed defensive positions on both shoulders of the narrowing pocket. Infantry divisions began streaming eastward through the opening. Every hour of delay Montgomery imposed was another hour for German troops to escape. For 5 critical days, from August 13th to August 18th, the gap remained open while Montgomery prepared to close it properly. When the gap finally closed on August 21st, the destruction was real but incomplete. Between 20,000 and 50,000 German troops were captured. Thousands more were killed. The Falaise pocket became a scene of devastation, with destroyed vehicles and equipment littering the roads. But between 20,000 and 100,000 German troops escaped through the gap before it closed. They escaped with critical equipment, including tanks and artillery. They escaped with their command structure intact. Those escaped German forces would form new defensive lines along the German border. They would man the Siegfried-Nuremberg fortifications. They would fight through the fall and winter of 1944.
They would launch the Battle of the Bulge in December. They would force the Allies to fight for every mile across France, Belgium, and into Germany. The war in Europe would last 8 more months and cost hundreds of thousands more Allied casualties, all because Montgomery insisted on closing the Falaise Gap methodically instead of aggressively. Patton was apoplectic. He told Bradley the delay was inexcusable. "We've got to close that gap now, not next week," he said on August 14th. When Bradley explained that Eisenhower wanted to avoid confusion by letting Montgomery coordinate the closure, Patton exploded. "Let me go to Falaise and we'll drive the British back into the sea for another Dunkirk," he said, only half joking. The bitterness between American and British commanders grew with every German truck that escaped eastward. What the Germans thought about Falaise became clear in post-war interrogations. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Eberbach, who helped organize the escape, called Montgomery's delay a gift from heaven. He explained that if Allied forces had closed the gap on August 13th or 14th, the war in the West would have ended in August 1944. SS Brigadeführer Kurt Meyer, who commanded the 12th SS Panzer Division, was more direct. He said, "Montgomery saved the German army in France. His caution gave us time we didn't deserve." But Montgomery's most spectacular failure was yet to come. In September 1944, flush with optimism after the liberation of Paris and Brussels, Montgomery proposed Operation Martin Garden. It would be the largest airborne operation in history. 3.5 airborne divisions would drop behind German lines to seize bridges across the rivers of Holland. British 30 Corps would race 64 miles up that single highway to cross the final bridge at Arnhem over the Rhine River. Once across the Rhine, Allied forces could bypass the Siegfried Line and drive into the industrial heart of Germany. Montgomery promised Eisenhower the operation would end the war by Christmas. He was so confident he overruled objections from his own intelligence officers, who reported that 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting near Arnhem. Montgomery dismissed the reports. He had made up his mind. The operation would proceed. On September 17, 1944, over 30,000 paratroopers and glider infantry dropped into Holland. The first day went well. Most bridges were captured, but 30 Corps, advancing up that single highway, moved slowly, too slowly.
Montgomery's plan required 30 Corps to advance 64 miles in 48 hours. It was the most aggressive timeline Montgomery had ever set. But even in his most ambitious operation, his cautious habits reasserted themselves. 30 Corps moved in a narrow column along a single road. When German forces blocked the road, instead of bypassing or using aggressive flanking maneuvers, British commanders stopped to prepare set-piece attacks. They advanced barely 6 miles on the first day. The schedule was already broken. At Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division was fighting for survival. They had captured the northern end of the bridge, but German reinforcements were pouring into the area. Those 2 SS Panzer divisions Montgomery's intelligence officers had warned about were very real. The lightly armed paratroopers were facing tanks and self-propelled guns. They held the bridge for 4 days, waiting for 30 Corps to arrive. 30 Corps was still 11 miles away, fighting through German defensive positions, one roadblock at a time. On September 21st, 4 days into the operation, German forces overwhelmed the British paratroopers at Arnhem Bridge. The survivors withdrew into a shrinking perimeter in the suburb of Oosterbeek. They radioed desperately for relief. 30 Corps finally reached the southern bank of the Rhine on September 23rd, 6 days late. They could see the trapped paratroopers across the river, but couldn't reach them. On the night of September 25th, the remnants of the 1st Airborne Division evacuated across the Rhine. Of the 10,000 men who landed at Arnhem, only 2,000 escaped. Market Garden was Montgomery's greatest defeat. It failed for multiple reasons, including intelligence failures, bad weather, and German defensive skill. But the core problem was the same as always. Montgomery's operational caution infected his subordinates. Even when the plan demanded speed and risk-taking, British commanders reverted to the methodical approach Montgomery had drilled into them. The result was 17,000 Allied casualties and no crossing of the Rhine. The war would not end in 1944. German commanders were beginning to recognize a pattern they could exploit systematically.
General Hasso von Manteuffel, who would later command 5th Panzer Army in the Battle of the Bulge, was interviewed by American military historians in 1945. He explained the Wehrmacht's defensive strategy against Montgomery in stark terms. Against Patton, we had to react instantly or be overrun, von Manteuffel said. Against Montgomery, we had time to think, time to prepare, time to withdraw if necessary. He gave us the one thing we never had enough of: time. Von Manteuffel wasn't the only German commander who recognized this. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded German forces in the West for most of the war, gave extensive interviews to Allied interrogators after his capture. When asked to compare Allied commanders, Rundstedt was candid. Patton was by far the most dangerous. He would attack before we were ready, exploit success before we could react, and never give us time to establish defensive positions. And Montgomery? Montgomery was predictable. We always knew we would have time to prepare for his attacks. These weren't isolated opinions. German military professionals analyzing Allied commanders reached remarkably consistent conclusions. General Fritz Bayerlein, who had served under Rommel in Africa and commanded the Panzer Lehr Division in Normandy, told his interrogators that Montgomery's thoroughness was both his strength and his fatal weakness. He never attacked until he was certain of success. This meant we never surprised Montgomery. We could always predict where and when he would attack based on his supply buildup and artillery positioning. The mathematics of Montgomery's caution became clear in comparative analysis. Patton's Third Army, operating from August 1944 to May 1945, averaged 27 miles per day during offensive operations. Bradley's 12th Army Group averaged 22 miles per day over the same period. Montgomery's 21st Army Group averaged 11 miles per day over the same period. Montgomery's forces consumed more supplies per mile advanced than any other Allied army group. They fired more artillery shells per enemy casualty inflicted. They took fewer risks and achieved slower results. But the numbers that really mattered were the ones German commanders calculated. How many divisions escaped because Montgomery paused to reorganize? How many defensive lines were established because Montgomery gave them time to withdraw? How many months was the war extended because Montgomery advanced cautiously instead of aggressively? General der Panzertruppen Eberbach attempted to quantify this in his interrogation. Every week of delay in closing the Falaise Gap was worth a month of resistance later, he estimated. Market Garden's failure gave us another 2 months. Montgomery's slow advance to the Rhine gave us the winter to prepare. By late 1944, the German High Command was actively trying to manipulate Allied command decisions to keep Montgomery in charge of critical sectors. Captured documents revealed that German intelligence was tracking which Allied armies faced which German positions. When Montgomery's forces were opposite German lines, German commanders knew they could afford to transfer mobile reserves to face Patton or other aggressive American commanders. Montgomery's predictability made German defensive planning dramatically easier.
The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the final proof. When Hitler launched his desperate offensive through the Ardennes, German planning documents specifically noted Montgomery's positions and predicted his response. They were right. After Eisenhower gave Montgomery command of Allied forces north of the German penetration, Montgomery did exactly what German planners expected. He stabilized the line, prepared methodical counterattacks, and advanced cautiously once the German offensive stalled. Patton, attacking from the south, moved with his characteristic aggression. His Third Army covered over 100 miles through winter weather, disengaged from offensive operations, pivoted 90 degrees, and smashed into the German southern flank. By early January, the German offensive was collapsing. Montgomery's contribution was solid but unspectacular. He had stabilized the northern sector, but Patton had broken the attack. The contrast couldn't have been starker. General Fritz Bayerlein, who fought against both commanders during the Battle of the Bulge, summarized it perfectly in his post-war interrogation. When Patton attacked, we had to commit everything immediately or be overrun. When Montgomery attacked, we knew we had 48 to 72 hours to prepare our response. That 48 to 72 hours made all the difference between survival and destruction for German forces. By March 1945, as Allied forces approached the Rhine River, the pattern had repeated so many times it was almost comical. Montgomery spent weeks preparing for his crossing of the Rhine near Wesel.
He assembled 25,000 tons of ammunition, positioned over 5,500 artillery pieces, and coordinated massive airborne drops. The crossing on March 23rd was a success, executed with textbook precision. But it took place 2 weeks after Patton had already crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim with minimal preparation and virtually no losses. Patton's crossing was improvised, aggressive, and completely unexpected by German forces. Montgomery's crossing was thoroughly prepared, heavily supported, and exactly what German intelligence had predicted down to the day and hour. When Patton called Montgomery to tell him about his crossing, he couldn't resist twisting the knife. "Tell the world that Third Army crossed the Rhine on the run, without bombardment, without airborne support, and without any fanfare whatsoever," Patton said. The final accounting of what Montgomery's caution cost the Allies came in the form of post-war analysis by military historians. Studies estimated that if the Falaise Gap had been closed 3 days earlier, the war might have ended in November 1944. If Market Garden had succeeded, Allied forces could have crossed the Rhine by October 1944. If Montgomery had pursued Rommel more aggressively after Alamein, the North African campaign might have ended months earlier. Each delay, each pause to reorganize, each insistence on overwhelming superiority before advancing gave German forces exactly what Field Marshal von Rundstedt said they needed most: time. Time to escape encirclement, time to establish new defensive positions, time to evacuate equipment and personnel, time to regroup shattered formations, time to extend a war that was already strategically lost. The ultimate irony emerged from captured German intelligence assessments compiled throughout 1944 and 1945. Wehrmacht officers had developed detailed profiles of Allied commanders, rating them by aggressiveness, unpredictability, and operational tempo. Patton scored highest in all categories marked as threats. Montgomery scored lowest. In one particularly damning assessment dated January 1945, a German intelligence summary noted, "Montgomery remains our most valuable opponent. His methodical approach continues to provide opportunities for tactical withdrawal and reorganization." General Hasso von Manteuffel, in extensive interviews conducted in 1945 and 1946, expanded on why German commanders viewed Montgomery the way they did. "Patton we feared because he operated on our own principles, speed, surprise, and violence of action," von Manteuffel explained. "Montgomery we appreciated because he operated on principles that gave us time to react. In modern warfare, especially when you're losing, time is the most precious commodity. Montgomery gave us time consistently." Von Manteuffel went further. He estimated that Montgomery's caution approach extended the war by approximately 6 months compared to what might have happened with more aggressive Allied commanders across the entire front. 6 months meant hundreds of thousands of additional casualties on all sides. 6 months meant hundreds of additional bombing raids on German cities. 6 months meant continuation of the Holocaust's final phase. 6 months because one British general couldn't adapt his methods to the realities of a war already won strategically. The mathematics were brutal. From D-Day to VE Day took 11 months. During Market Garden alone, delays cost approximately 6 weeks of fighting that might have been avoided. The Falaise Gap delays cost another month. Montgomery's slow advance after the Rhine crossing cost perhaps another 3 weeks. Add it all together, and you approach von Manteufel's 6-month estimate. The Wehrmacht's best weapon wasn't a tank or a gun. It was British Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. Churchill understood this, at least partially. In private conversations with his military advisors, Churchill repeatedly expressed frustration with Montgomery's pace. But politically, Churchill couldn't replace Britain's national hero. The British public demanded a British general in a prominent role. Montgomery had won victories, even if they came slower than necessary. Removing him would have been politically catastrophic for Churchill's government. So Montgomery stayed in command, and German forces kept getting the time they needed to survive.
After the war, Montgomery wrote his memoirs. He portrayed himself as the architect of Allied victory in Europe. He claimed his methodical approach had minimized British casualties while achieving consistent success. He argued that aggressive commanders like Patton wasted lives through reckless attacks. The British public largely accepted Montgomery's version. He was elevated to Viscount Montgomery of Alamein. He served as Chief of the Imperial General Staff and Deputy Supreme Commander of NATO. But in Germany, in the interrogation rooms and prisoner of war camps where Wehrmacht officers discussed the war with brutal honesty, a different story emerged. General der Panzertruppen Eberbach put it most succinctly in his final assessment before being released from custody. The Americans had Patton and Bradley. The British had Montgomery. We feared the Americans. We thanked God for the British. Montgomery's caution was worth 10 divisions to us, perhaps more. The lesson that emerged from German assessments of Montgomery was simple but profound. In modern mechanized warfare, speed and aggression matter more than methodical preparation. An imperfect attack executed immediately is often more effective than a perfect attack delayed. The enemy's mistakes and confusion are fleeting opportunities that vanish if not exploited instantly. Montgomery never learned this lesson, or perhaps he learned it but couldn't change his nature. His entire military philosophy was built on certainty, on overwhelming superiority, on eliminating every possible variable before committing to action. This worked at Alamein when he had unlimited time to prepare and Rommel had nowhere to go. It failed everywhere else because it gave the enemy the one thing they needed most when facing defeat, the chance to survive and fight another day. On that December day in 1945, when General von Manteuffel told his American interrogators that German forces called Montgomery their best weapon, he wasn't being sarcastic. He was stating a tactical reality that Wehrmacht commanders had recognized and exploited for 3 years. Montgomery's predictability, his caution, his insistence on preparation over speed had become as valuable to German defensive planning as any weapon in their arsenal. The Americans in that interrogation room understood immediately. They had fought alongside Montgomery. They had watched him hesitate when aggression was needed. They had seen German forces escape because Montgomery insisted on reorganizing when pursuit was essential. Von Manteufel's assessment confirmed what American commanders had known since Sicily. Britain's greatest general was helping Germany's armies survive. And so, history records Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery as one of the great Allied commanders of World War II. The hero of Alamein, the meticulous planner, the methodical professional. But it also records, in the testimonies of the German commanders who faced him, a more uncomfortable truth, that Montgomery's tactical caution gave the Wehrmacht exactly what it needed when facing inevitable defeat: time to escape, time to regroup, and time to extend a war that should have ended months earlier. The German officers who called Montgomery their best weapon weren't wrong. They were simply telling a truth that neither the British public nor Montgomery himself ever wanted to hear. In total war, when the enemy is already beaten strategically, the greatest sin isn't making mistakes, it's giving them time to recover from yours.